Choi Min-jae had dismantled rival corporations without a second thought, his pulse never rising above a steady, cold rhythm even during the most hostile takeovers. Yet, as he stood on the illuminated stage of the Seoul Grand Ballroom, the oversized donation check in his hand suddenly felt heavier than any billion-dollar contract he had ever signed. The hall gleamed with a performative kind of benevolence, crystal chandeliers refracting light onto the polished shoes of the elite, a place where wealth whispered in the rustle of silk and shouted in the glare of camera flashes. He had chosen to sponsor this gala precisely because it was high-profile, a calculated million-dollar signature intended to erase the stain of recent corporate scandals and finalize his public image as a visionary benefactor. Tonight was meant to be a simple transaction. Hand over the check, offer a rehearsed smile for the evening news, and leave with his reputation neatly repaired. But as the master of ceremonies stepped aside and Min-jae raised his eyes to greet the event's organizer, the world beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes shifted violently. Behind the podium stood Frances Ashcroft, the woman he had buried under years of global expansions, aggressive acquisitions, and carefully constructed success. She was the only person who had ever truly seen him, not as the titan of the Choi Group, but as the rebellious art student who once traced the intricate ink of his neck tattoos with her fingertips. The air in the ballroom crystallized into something brittle and dangerous. Frances was different now. The paint-stained overalls of her youth had been replaced by a tailored peach blazer that radiated a professional, guarded confidence. Her hair was styled in elegant curls that framed a face that looked back at him with a gaze so sharp it felt like a physical indictment. But it wasn't just the sight of her that stopped his heart. Tucked slightly behind her, clutching a weathered teddy bear, was a young boy. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The child possessed the same dark, analytical eyes that Min-jae saw in the mirror every morning. Eyes that watched the chaos of the gala with a mixture of curiosity and quiet anxiety. Recognition dawned in the pit of Min-jae's stomach like a slow-moving storm. He did the math in a frantic heartbeat, the months and years since their final, bitter argument collapsing into a single, devastating number. The blinding flashes of the paparazzi, which he had courted only moments before, now felt like searchlights exposing a crime. In the high-stakes theater of his life, Min-jae realized he had been conquered by his own absence. He stood there, the billionaire sponsor with $1 million check that had suddenly become as worthless as a scrap of paper, staring at the 6-year-old secret that changed everything. The glare of the spotlight was supposed to be a crowning moment for the Choi Group, but for Min-jae, it felt like being trapped in a glass cage. He stepped toward the center of the stage, the heavy foam board of the donation check tucked under one arm like a conquered banner. Every eye in the ballroom followed his movement. The crowd of dignitaries and socialites hushed in anticipation of the billionaire's benevolence. Min-jae adjusted the lapels of his brown suit, feeling the phantom itch of the ink beneath his collar. To the cameras, he was a reformed titan, his slicked-back hair and sharp jawline projecting an image of absolute discipline. But the tattoos creeping up his neck, the jagged, dark lines he had once used as a shield against the world, seemed to pulse with a life of their own, mocking the saint image he was trying so desperately to project. He reached the podium and placed the check on the easel. $1 million. To the board of directors, this was a line item in the marketing budget. To the public, it was proof of his heart. But as he stood there, forced to look out at the woman who had helped him draw the original sketches of his life, the number felt laughably small. Frances didn't move. She stood near the edge of the stage, her arms crossed over her peach blazer, a silent sentinel of a past he had tried to overwrite. She wasn't clapping. She wasn't smiling. She was simply watching him with an expression that saw right through the bespoke tailoring and the PR-scripted grace. Min-jae's hand gripped the edge of the podium, his knuckles turning white. He had practiced this speech for a week, a series of platitudes about giving back and corporate responsibility, but the words had turned to dry ash in his throat. Beside her, the boy looked up, his small face illuminated by the stage lights. Jordan. The name echoed in Min-jae's mind, a rhythmic drumbeat of lost time. The child tilted his head, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear as he stared at the man on the stage. Min-jae realized with a jolt of terror that the boy was looking at the tattoos on his neck. Those lines were a map of a man who no longer existed. Yet here was a child who carried the very DNA of the person who had first etched them. Ladies and gentlemen, Min Jae began, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it into its usual baritone command. He looked at the teleprompter, the scrolling green text urging him to talk about the future, about the legacy of the Choi Group. But every time he tried to focus on the script, his gaze was pulled back to the boy clutching the teddy bear. The contrast was staggering. Here stood the billionaire, a man who could move markets with a single text, appearing as the ultimate savior. Yet, the real power in the room resided in the 6-year-old secret standing 10 feet away. Min Jae felt the weight of the cameras, the hundreds of lenses recording this saintly presentation, and for the first time in a decade, he felt like a fraud. He wasn't giving a donation. He was paying a ransom for his soul, and he realized with a sinking heart that even $1 billion wouldn't be enough to bridge the distance between the podium and the family he had abandoned. The applause began, a polite, roaring sound that filled the cavernous hall, but to Min Jae, it sounded like the crashing of waves. He stood frozen, a statue of success with a heart of lead, trapped between the man he was supposed to be and the father he had never known he was. The applause was a hollow, echoing roar that seemed to originate from another world. As Min Jae stepped down from the stage, the heavy check now in the hands of a smiling foundation board member, the forced composure of his saint persona began to crack. He moved toward the edge of the stage, his eyes locked onto a single point in the vast, glittering ballroom. Frances stood there, unmoving, her presence a stark, vibrant defiance against the sea of black tuxedos and dark evening gowns. Her peach blazer caught the light, the sharp lines of the tailoring acting like a suit of armor that protected her from the opulence he represented. She didn't look like a woman who had spent years in hiding. She looked like a woman who had spent years building a fortress. As Min Jae approached, the distance between them felt like a physical weight, a chasm filled with 6 years of silence and unmade apologies. Her arms remained crossed, a physical barrier that signaled she was not there to be a part of his narrative. She stared him down with a gaze that was neither angry nor soft. It was guarded, a calculated assessment that treated him as a potential threat to be managed rather than a man she had once shared a bed with. The closer he got, the more the analytical blindness that had defined his career began to fail him. Usually, when Min Jae looked at someone, he saw data, leverage, net worth, potential utility. But looking at Frances, he saw only the ghost of a version of himself he had tried to kill. The boy who didn't care about the Choi Group. The boy who drew on napkins and promised her the world without ever mentioning a price tag. Then, his focus shifted downward. The boy, Jordan, was leaning against Frances's hip, the casual, instinctive way children claim their world. He was small, perhaps smaller than Min Jae had expected for 6 years, but his presence was colossal. In his arms, he clutched a teddy bear, a worn, brown thing with one ear slightly frayed and a ribbon that had seen better days. The toy was a jarring intrusion of childhood innocence in a room dedicated to the cold acquisition of influence. Jordan's eyes weren't guarded like his mother's. They were wide and searching. As Min Jae came to a halt a few feet away, the boy's grip on the bear tightened, his knuckles turning a soft, pale brown. He looked up at Min Jae, then down at the neck tattoos that peeked above the stiff collar of the designer suit. There was a spark of recognition in the child's eyes, not of a father, but of a mirror. The way the boy tilted his head, the slight furrow in his brow as he processed the intensity of the man standing before him, was so painfully familiar that Min Jae felt the air leave his lungs. Frances stepped slightly forward, a subtle movement that partially shielded the boy from Min Jae's gaze. It was a reflex, a mother protecting her cub from a predator she knew all too well. "Welcome to the gala, Mr. Choi," she said, her voice like glass, clear, cold, and capable of cutting. She used his formal title as if to remind him that, in this space, he was nothing more than a donor, a signature on a check, and a stranger to the life she had built in the ruins of their marriage. Min Jae tried to speak, but the billionaire CEO was gone, replaced by a man drowning in the realization that while he had been buying the world, he had been losing the only part of it that actually mattered. He looked at the peach blazer, the guarded eyes, and the little boy with the teddy bear, and for the first time in his life, he didn't have a plan. The heavy double doors of the private dressing room clicked shut, muffling the polished roar of the gala to a ghostly hum. Choi Min-jae leaned his back against the wood, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon through the very boardrooms he usually commanded. He reached up, tearing at the silk tie that suddenly felt like a hangman's noose, and fumbled for the edge of the marble vanity. The cool stone beneath his palms was the only thing keeping him grounded. He looked into the mirror, but he didn't see the billionaire CEO of the Choi Group. He saw a man haunted by a timeline he had spent 6 years trying to outrun. His mind, usually a precision instrument capable of calculating market shifts and risk-to-reward ratios in milliseconds, began to churn with a different kind of data. He closed his eyes, forcing himself back to the final weeks of their marriage. The memories were jagged, stained with the bitter acidity of their last arguments. He remembered the coldness of their Gangnam apartment, the way Francis had looked at him with a mixture of pity and exhaustion while he took calls from London at 3 in the morning. He counted back. April. The late spring rain in Seoul had been relentless that year. It was the month the Singapore expansion had been finalized, the month he had officially chosen the empire over the woman. But it was also the month of their brief, desperate attempt at reconciliation. One night of fragile peace before the final storm broke. He did the math again, his fingers twitching against the marble. 9 months from that April would have been January of the following year. 6 years. The boy outside, Jordan, had eyes that held the exact same intensity Min-jae had seen in his own childhood photos, before the world had taught him to hide behind a mask of corporate ruthlessness. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the solar plexus, leaving him breathless. The analytical blindness that had been his greatest asset was now his greatest curse. He couldn't unsee the logic of the dates. He couldn't calculate a way out of the truth. Jordan wasn't just a child at a charity event. He was the living evidence of the 6 years Min-jae had traded for a seat at the head of a table that suddenly felt incredibly empty. A wave of internal panic, cold and paralyzing, washed over him. He thought of the missed milestones, the first steps, the first words, the nights spent clutching that weathered teddy bear while Min-jae was busy acquiring companies he didn't even need. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had just signed $1 million check, and felt a profound sense of poverty. He had always believed that success was a destination you arrived at alone, a mountain you climbed by shedding everything that made you heavy. He had shed Francis to reach the summit. He had shed his own history. But looking at the empty room around him, surrounded by the trappings of a life he had curated for the cameras, he realized he hadn't reached the top. He had simply wandered into a desert of his own making. The secret Francis had kept wasn't just a child. It was the reality of the man he could have been if he hadn't let the ambition consume him. He sank onto the velvet stool, his head in his hands, the silence of the room screaming with the weight of the years he could never buy back. The smell of the expensive cologne and the sterile, floral scent of the dressing room faded, replaced by the ghost of cheap coffee and the metallic tang of rain on pavement. In the silence of his self-imposed exile, Min-jae's mind retreated 12 years, back to a cramped, dimly lit diner in a part of the city where the neon signs always flickered and the ambition was as raw as the weather. He was 22 then, a man who wore his defiance like a second skin. His hair wasn't slicked back into a corporate mold. It was a mess of dark strands that shadowed a face perpetually set in a scowl. The tattoos on his neck were fresh, the ink dark and slightly raised, symbols of a rebellion against a world that had told him he was too loud, too aggressive, and too much of an outsider to ever belong. He had been a high school dropout with a mind that moved faster than the logic of the streets, a man who spent his nights hunched over cracked tables, sketching the future on the only canvas he could afford, damp paper napkins. It was a Tuesday night, the kind of evening where the mist turned into a steady, bone-chilling drizzle, when Frances Ashcroft walked into his world. She was an art student then, carrying a portfolio that looked like it had survived a war, and wearing a coat that was 2 sizes too big. She didn't look like the polished event coordinator in the peach blazer. She looked like a girl who saw colors where everyone else saw gray. Min-jae hadn't looked up when she sat in the booth across from him. He was too busy mapping out an architecture of data, a complex web of logic that would one day become the foundation of the Choi Group. His pen was bleeding through the thin paper of the napkin, the ink blooming in blue-black bursts. He expected her to ignore him, or perhaps to look at his tattoos with the same wary judgment he received from the rest of the world. Instead, she leaned forward, her chin resting in her hand, and watched the tip of his pen move. "That's not just a sketch," she had said, her voice a warm melody that cut through the low hum of the diner's refrigerator. "It's a skeleton. You're building something." Min-jae had finally looked up, his scowl deepening as he prepared a sharp retort. But the words died in his throat when he saw her eyes. They weren't filled with fear or condescension. They were filled with a fierce, quiet curiosity. She wasn't looking at the ink on his skin as a warning. She was looking at it as a story. "It's a waste of time," he had muttered, trying to pull the napkin away. "Nothing that starts with that much passion is a waste of time," she replied, reaching out to stop his hand. Her touch was light, but it felt like a jolt of electricity to a man who had spent his life keeping everyone at arm's length. She picked up one of the discarded napkins, smoothing out the wrinkles. "Most people see a thug in a brown suit. I see someone who's trying to rewrite the rules of a game he wasn't invited to play." For the next 3 hours, the diner had disappeared. He told her about the software, about the dreams of a startup that existed only in the margins of his notebooks, and about the anger that fueled his every move. He expected her to laugh, to tell him he was delusional. Instead, she took her own pencil and began to draw in the white space around his logic, tiny, intricate flourishes that made his cold data feel like a living, breathing thing. "I believe in this," she told him that night, her eyes locked onto his with a conviction that terrified him. "And I believe in the man who's going to build it." She was the first person who hadn't asked him to change. She didn't want him to hide the ink or temper the ambition. She saw the sketches on napkins and didn't see a dreamer. She saw a titan. She was the one who had stayed up with him when the servers crashed, the one who had celebrated when the first investor, a man she had convinced to meet him, finally said yes. Min-jae opened his eyes in the dressing room, the memory of her belief hitting him with a fresh wave of agony. He realized then that the tragedy of his life wasn't that he had become successful. It was that he had become exactly the kind of man Francis had once protected him from. He had used her belief to build a cage of gold, and in the process, he had traded the girl who loved the rebellious outsider for a world that only loved the billionaire. The transition from the flickering neon of the diner to the sterile, sun-drenched heights of a penthouse office wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, glacial hardening of the soul. Success, when it finally arrived, didn't feel like the victory Min-jae had envisioned on his paper napkins. It arrived as a relentless, hungry machine that demanded more than just his intellect. It demanded his identity. The shared dreams he and Francis had nurtured over cheap coffee were digitized into cold, high-stakes spreadsheets. The startup that had once been their us against the world, rebellion transformed into the Choi Group, a burgeoning empire that required constant feeding. Min-jae remembered the first time he had to truly hide himself. It was a Tuesday morning, the day of a meeting with a group of conservative investors who held the keys to his international expansion. He stood before a full-length mirror in their new, echoing apartment, watching his reflection with a sense of mounting foreignness. He picked up a bespoke white shirt, the fabric so fine it felt like a second skin, and began to button the collar. As the stiff fabric rose, it slowly eclipsed the jagged ink on his neck. He reached for a silk tie, pulling the knot tight until the last remnants of his rebellion were tucked away beneath the armor of a three-piece suit. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had once been stained with ink and grease, and saw only the pristine, manicured fingers of a man who no longer touched anything real. "You look like them," Francis had said that morning, leaning against the doorframe. She wasn't wearing her paint-stained overalls anymore. She was dressed in a silk gown he had bought her, but she looked more uncomfortable in the luxury than he did in the suit. Her eyes, once full of fierce curiosity, were clouded with a growing, quiet apprehension. "I look like a man who can win," he had replied, checking his watch, a gold piece that cost more than their first year of rent. "This is what we wanted, Francis. The security, the power. I wanted the man who sketched on napkins," she whispered, but the sound was drowned out by the chime of his encrypted phone. As the months bled into years, the analytical blindness he had cultivated to survive the boardroom began to bleed into his home life. He started to view his time with Francis as an overhead cost, something to be managed and minimized in favor of growth. The corporate culture of the chaebol elite, which he had once mocked with such vitriol, began to shape him in its own image. He learned that in the upper echelons of Seoul's power structure, sacrifice wasn't just expected, it was the currency of entry. He began to stay at the office until the sun rose, convinced that every acquisition and every hostile takeover was a brick in a fortress he was building for their future. He didn't realize that by the time the fortress was finished, he would be the only one left inside it. The tattoos that once meant he was unbuyable were now hidden shames, secrets he guarded as closely as his trade algorithms. He had successfully infiltrated the world that had rejected him, but to do it, he had to become a stranger to the only person who had ever truly known him. The rebellious outsider was gone, replaced by a titan who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. The silence of their Gangnam penthouse had become a physical weight, a dense, suffocating pressure that even the most expensive air filtration systems couldn't scrub away. It was a Tuesday in April, the same month Min Jae would later identify as the beginning of his greatest reckoning, and the rain was streaking against the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the Seoul skyline into a blurred gallery of neon ghosts. Francis sat at the long, obsidian dining table, a single candle burning low in its crystal holder. The dinner she had prepared hours ago sat untouched, the meticulously plated food now nothing more than a cold, congealed monument to an evening that had never happened. She didn't check her watch. She didn't need to. The rhythm of her life had been reduced to the ticking of the clock and the distant, muffled chime of the elevator that rarely brought the man she had married home before the sun began to bleed into the horizon. She looked at the empty chair across from her, the chair intended for the man who had once promised her that no matter how big the dream became, there would always be room for us. When the front door finally clicked open at 2:14 a.m., there was no rush of relief. There was only the sound of leather soles on marble, efficient and heavy. Min Jae entered the room like a man stepping into a briefing, his tie already loosened, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen of the phone in his hand. He didn't see the candle. He didn't see the cold plates. He didn't even see the woman who had spent the last 4 hours rehearsing a way to tell him that she was drowning in the silence. "The London merger is stalling," he muttered, his voice raspy from a day of shouting over the noise of the global market. He didn't look up. "I have to be back in the office by 6 for the opening of the Hong Kong exchange. I'll just sleep for a few hours in the study." Francis watched him, really watched him, and for the first time, the analytical blindness he had cultivated started to feel contagious. She looked at the sharp, tailored lines of his suit and the way his slicked-back hair stayed perfectly in place, and she realized that the rebellious art student with the neck tattoos was officially dead. The man who had once sketched their future on paper napkins had been entirely overwritten by a CEO who saw his own home as nothing more than a temporary transit hub. "Min Jae," she said, her voice a soft, steady vibration in the cavernous room. He paused, his thumb hovering over the screen, but he still didn't meet her gaze. "Whatever it is, can it wait until the quarterly reports are finalized?" "I'm underwater, Francis." "You're not underwater," she replied, standing up slowly. The silk of her dress rustled, a sound that seemed loud in the tomb-like quiet. "You're just gone. You've been gone for a long time." He finally looked up then, but his expression wasn't one of concern. It was one of irritation. He looked at her the way he looked at a balance sheet that wouldn't resolve, as a problem to be managed, an inefficiency to be corrected. "I'm doing this for us," he snapped, the old anger flickering in his eyes. "Everything I've built, every acquisition, every late night, it's for our legacy." "Whose legacy, Min Jae?" she asked, walking toward him until she could see the faint, dark ink of the tattoos hidden beneath his stiff collar. "There is no us in this building. There's only a billionaire and the wife who waits for a husband who stopped coming back years ago. I'm not waiting for a legacy. I'm waiting for a person who doesn't exist anymore." He didn't argue. He didn't offer a promise he had no intention of keeping. He simply looked back at his phone, the blue light reflecting in his eyes like a digital shield. "I don't have time for this tonight," he said, turning toward the study. Francis didn't cry. She had already shed her tears in the months leading up to this moment. Instead, she walked to the bedroom and began to pack a single suitcase. She didn't take the jewelry he had bought to apologize for his absence. She didn't take the designer clothes that felt like costumes. She took only her sketchbooks, her paints, and the memory of a man who used to believe that love was the only thing worth acquiring. By the time the sun began to rise over the Han River, the apartment was truly silent. There was no grand confrontation, no shattered glass. On the obsidian dining table, beside the cold dinner and the extinguished candle, she left a simple note written on a scrap of paper she had found in her art bag. It didn't contain an indictment or a demand for a settlement. It was just a quiet echo of the woman she was rediscovering. "I need to find what I've lost," the note read. "I hope you find what you're looking for." She left before the elevator chime could tell him she was gone, walking out into the crisp morning air of a world that was suddenly, terrifyingly wide. She was pregnant, alone, and heartbroken, but as she looked at the rising sun, she realized she was finally free of the man who had become a stranger in his own life. The shadows backstage were long and filled with the skeletal remains of the gala's efficiency, coiled cables, empty equipment cases, and the hushed, frantic whispers of stagehands. Choi Min-jae moved through the dimness like a predator, his polished shoes silent on the industrial floor. He had ignored the handlers trying to guide him to the VIP reception and the reporters clamoring for a quote about his generous spirit. None of that mattered. The only thing that existed in his narrowed field of vision was the flash of a peach blazer disappearing behind a heavy velvet curtain. He found them in a small, utilitarian green room meant for performers. The room was a stark contrast to the gilded ballroom he had just vacated. It smelled of stale coffee and dust. Frances was there, her back to him as she helped Jordan into a small, navy blue coat. The boy's teddy bear sat on a nearby folding chair, watching the room with its one frayed ear. Frances. She didn't jump. She didn't even stiffen. She simply finished buttoning the boy's coat before turning around. Her expression was perfectly level, a masterclass in professional detachment that made Min-jae's chest ache with a familiar, sharp frustration. "The exits are to the north, Mr. Choi," she said, her voice a cool, rhythmic cadence. "Your driver is likely waiting." "Stop it," Min-jae snapped, the billionaire's authority bleeding through his desperation. He stepped further into the room, the door clicking shut behind him, sealing them in a tomb of his own making. "I did the math. I looked at him. I know, Frances." A flicker of something, was it weariness or pity, passed through her eyes before she masked it. She placed a hand on Jordan's shoulder. The boy looked between them, his dark, analytical eyes tracing the jagged lines of the tattoos on Min-jae's neck with a terrifying intensity. "What do you know?" Frances asked quietly. "He's 6. We were together in April. The timeline is undeniable." Min-jae moved closer, his hands hovering as if he wanted to reach out, but didn't know how to bridge the gap. "Why didn't you tell me? I have resources. I have a legacy. He is a Choi." Frances let out a short, hollow laugh that didn't reach her eyes. She stood taller, her peach blazer a bright, defiant shield against his dark suit. "A Choi? You mean an asset? A line item in your quarterly report? I didn't tell you because I didn't want him to grow up in a fortress built of gold and silence, waiting for a father who only shows up when there's a camera nearby." Min-jae felt the old, cold logic of the boardroom rise to his defense. It was the only way he knew how to navigate a world that was suddenly without a map. "I can fix this," he said, his voice dropping into the tone he used to close multi-billion-dollar mergers. "I can provide him with the best tutors in the world. I can set up a trust that will ensure his influence for generations. We can discuss the terms of visitation. I'll be flexible. I'll hire the best security, the best doctors. He won't want for anything." Frances looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment, Min-jae felt like the art student in the diner again, exposed by her gaze. "Listen to yourself," she whispered. "Terms? Visitation? Flexibility? You're trying to negotiate for a son, Min-jae. You're looking for a way to acquire him like a startup you missed out on during the first round of funding." "I'm trying to be responsible," he roared, the sound echoing off the cinder block walls. Jordan flinched, clutching his teddy bear tighter, and Min-jae felt a visceral pang of shame. Frances stepped forward, her face inches from his. "Responsibility isn't a wire transfer, Min-jae. It's being there when he has a nightmare at 3 a.m. It's knowing that he hates the crust on his bread but loves the way the rain sounds on the window. It's being a person, not a CEO." She paused, her voice trembling with a decade of suppressed truth. Children aren't opportunities to be acquired. They aren't pieces of a legacy you can buy back with $1 million check. You can't negotiate for the last 6 years, and you certainly can't buy a place in his heart. Min-jae looked down at Jordan. The boy was staring at his hands that were pristine, manicured, and had never once changed a diaper or held a small, feverish head. He looked back at Frances, the woman who had believed in sketches on napkins, and realized that she was right. He had spent his entire life building a world where everything had a price, only to find himself standing in front of the only 2 people who weren't for sale. I don't want to buy him, Min-jae said, his voice finally breaking. I don't want to be a ghost anymore. Frances watched him for a long beat, her guarded expression softening by a fraction of a millimeter. Then stop acting like a ghost, she said, and stop acting like a sponsor. If you want to know him, you start at the beginning. And the beginning doesn't happen in a green room at a gala. It happens in the quiet, boring moments you've spent your whole life trying to avoid. Frances stepped back, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were retreating from a front line she had guarded for a lifetime. She didn't leave the room, but she leaned against the scarred wooden desk in the corner, her arms no longer crossed, but her eyes never wavering from the 2 of them. It was a silent, precarious truce. Min-jae felt the sudden, vacuum-like silence of the room. Without the shield of his argument with Frances, he was left exposed to the quiet, intense scrutiny of the boy. He realized, with a jolt of genuine fear, that he was more intimidated by this 6-year-old than he had ever been by a hostile board of directors. He looked down at his own hands, then slowly, painfully, he sank to one knee. The fabric of his expensive trousers strained against his movement, and the cold, dusty floor pressed against his skin, but he didn't care. He needed to be smaller. He needed to stop being the Titan. That's a very brave bear you have there, Min-jae said, his voice sounding thin and foreign to his own ears. Jordan didn't answer immediately. He tucked his chin into the soft, matted fur of the teddy bear's head, his dark eyes tracking the movement of Min-jae's lips. The boy's breathing was shallow, a rhythmic, anxious hitch that Min-jae recognized with a visceral ache. It was the same breath he took before walking into a high-stakes negotiation, the breath of someone who expected the world to be a battlefield. His name is Barnaby, Jordan whispered finally. The voice was small, but it held a curious, melodic clarity that echoed Frances. He's not brave. He's just careful. Careful is good, Min-jae replied, forced himself to keep his hands still at his sides. He wanted to reach out, to touch the boy's shoulder, but he knew any sudden movement would shatter the fragile thread between them. I used to be careful too. I used to draw things so I wouldn't be afraid of them. Jordan's gaze shifted upward, locking onto the jagged, dark ink that climbed Min-jae's neck. He reached out a small, hesitant finger, pointing toward a sharp curve of the tattoo that disappeared beneath the white silk collar. Did you draw those? Because you were afraid? Min-jae swallowed hard, the movement making the tattoos ripple. In a way, I drew them so people would know I wasn't easy to break. But sometimes, when you spend too much time trying not to break, you forget how to feel. The boy considered this, his brow furrowing in a way that was so purely, devastatingly Min-jae that the billionaire had to look away for a heartbeat to catch his breath. Jordan wasn't just looking at him. He was analyzing him. He was searching for patterns, for logic, for a reason why this stranger in the sharp suit was kneeling in the dust. Why was the check so big? Jordan asked suddenly, his curiosity momentarily overriding his caution. The one on the stage. It had too many zeros. It looked heavy. Min-jae let out a short, surprised breath that was almost a laugh. The boy hadn't seen the generosity or the philanthropy. He had seen the inefficiency of the object itself. He had seen the weight of the performative act. It was heavy, Min-jae admitted, looking the boy in the eye. It was heavy because I was trying to use it to fill a hole. But zeros can't fill holes, Jordan. No matter how many of them there are. Jordan nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. He loosened his grip on Barnaby by a fraction of an inch. Yama says that some people use loud things to hide quiet problems. Is that what you were doing? Min-jae felt the truth of the child's words strip away the last of his corporate armor. He saw himself in the boy's anxious stillness, in the way he clung to the bear for a sense of order in a chaotic room. He saw the hidden self he had buried under billion-dollar contracts, The boy who was always looking for the why. The boy who felt everything too loudly and used logic as a silencer. Yes, Min-jae said quietly. That is exactly what I was doing. But I think I'm tired of being loud. Jordan looked at Barnaby, then back at Min-jae. He took a small step forward, the bear still pressed to his chest, but his eyes were no longer wide with fear. They were filled with a profound, searching intelligence. If you stop being loud, the boy asked, will you still be a ghost? Min-jae reached out then, his hand trembling as he rested it lightly on the floor near Jordan's shoes. I'm trying very hard to stay right here, he promised. In the quiet. For the first time since he had stepped onto the gala stage, Min-jae didn't feel like a CEO. He didn't feel like a sponsor. He felt like a man who had finally found the one sketch he couldn't afford to lose. Choi Min-jae stood up, the dust of the green room floor leaving a faint, gray smudge on his custom-tailored trousers. He didn't brush it off. For the first time in his career, an imperfection felt earned. He looked at Francis, who was watching him with a stillness that no longer felt like a barricade, but a profound, shimmering question. He had given her $1 million on a stage in front of 1,000 people, and it had achieved nothing but more distance. He had approached the charity as he approached a hostile takeover, with a display of overwhelming force intended to compel a favorable outcome. The door to the green room swung open, and his chief of staff, a man who lived and breathed the Choi Group's quarterly cycles, stepped in with a frantic, buzzing energy. He was holding a smaller, glossy version of the donation check, the one intended for the handshake photographs that would lead tomorrow's financial section. Sir, the press is gathered in the north wing, the assistant said, his voice a sharp, rhythmic intrusion into the quiet. The foundation board is ecstatic. They want a photo with you, Ms. Ashcroft, and the child. It's the perfect narrative. The CEO and the next generation of philanthropy. We need to move now to catch the morning editions in London. Min-jae looked at the check in the man's hands. It was a beautiful piece of graphic design, the ink crisp and the numbers bold. It represented the analytical blindness he had worn like armor for a decade. It was a solution that cost him nothing but money, a resource he had in such abundance that it had lost its weight. To the man he had been an hour ago, this was the goal. The transaction was complete. The reputation was laundered. He reached out and took the check. It was light, frighteningly light for something that was supposed to represent his entire legacy. He looked at Jordan, who was still clutching Barnaby the bear, watching the exchange with that same curious caution. The boy didn't care about the millions. He didn't care about the Choi Group's market cap. He cared about whether the man in the suit was going to turn back into a ghost and disappear behind a wall of cameras. No, Min-jae said, his voice low and steady. Sir, the assistant blinked, his rehearsed smile faltering as he checked his watch. We're on a tight schedule. The car for the airport is. Min-jae didn't explain. He gripped the edges of the foam board, his knuckles turning white as he felt the resistance of the material. With a slow, deliberate motion, he twisted his hands. The sound of the foam snapping was surprisingly loud in the small room, a sharp, surgical crack that sounded like a bone breaking. He tore it again, and then once more, until the $1 million promise was nothing but a handful of white, jagged shards. He let the pieces flutter to the floor, landing in the dust near his feet like discarded confetti. The Choi Group is finished with this event, Min-jae said, not looking at his assistant, but at the woman in the peach blazer. Tell the press I've left. Tell the board the funds will be transferred electronically, but the sponsor is no longer available for comment. I am officially off the clock. The assistant stood frozen, staring at the debris of a perfectly managed PR moment. But sir, the schedule. You have the Tokyo expansion opening at dawn. Your jet is fueled. The investors are expecting a briefing. Cancel it, Min-jae said. Cancel all of it. For the next week. For the next month if you have to. If the board has a problem with it, tell them I'm conducting a private audit of my life. He turned back to Francis. The guarded look in her eyes had been replaced by a stunned, breathless silence. He realized he had just done something he had never done in his professional life. He had destroyed a contract without a counteroffer. He had walked away from a win because he finally realized he had been playing the wrong game. You were right, he said to her, his voice finally shedding the last of its corporate edge. I've been trying to buy my way back into a world I walked out of. I thought the check was a bridge, but it was just another wall I built to keep from having to actually show up. I don't want to be the man who signs the papers anymore. I'm tired of being a signature." He looked at Jordan, who was staring at the torn pieces of the check on the floor with wide, wondering eyes. Min-jae sank back down so he was eye level with the boy, ignoring the protest of his expensive suit. "I don't have any more zeros to give you tonight, Jordan," Min-jae said, his voice quiet enough that it was meant only for the three of them. "But I have tomorrow morning. And the morning after that. If your mom says it's okay, I'd like to spend them seeing what Barnaby is so careful about. I'd like to see the world without a camera flash in the way." Frances looked at the torn remains of the saint she had expected to encounter, and then at the man with the neck tattoos who was finally, truly standing in the quiet. She didn't smile yet. The 6 years of silence were too long for a single gesture to erase, but she reached out and rested her hand on Jordan's head, her fingers no longer trembling. She saw the man behind the ink, the one who had once built skeletons of dreams on napkins, finally resurfacing from the wreckage of the Billionaire. "The park near our place has a shop that sells chocolate ice cream," she said softly, her voice losing its brittle, defensive chill. "Jordan says it's the only thing that matters after a long day of being brave." Min-jae felt a surge of something that wasn't power, wasn't influence, and couldn't be measured in a net worth statement. It was possibility. It was the terrifying, beautiful sense that the future wasn't fixed by his past mistakes. "I think," Min-jae said, looking at his son, "that's a much better investment." The transition from the air-conditioned artifice of the ballroom to the humid, night air of the city felt like a physical shedding of a second skin. Choi Min-jae walked through the north wing of the convention center, his stride no longer the hurried, aggressive pace of a man chasing a closing bell. He led the way, but he wasn't leading a corporate delegation. He was creating a path for Frances and Jordan, his body shielding them from the lingering clusters of reporters who had sensed a shift in the evening's narrative. The camera flashes still erupted like miniature supernovas, but Min-jae didn't blink. He didn't offer a thumbs up or a practice quote. He simply kept his eyes on the exit, the saint image he had spent weeks crafting now nothing more than a discarded costume. His chief of staff made one final, desperate attempt to catch his sleeve near the heavy glass doors. "Sir, the board, they're calling. They've seen the social media leaks. They need a statement about the torn check." Min-jae paused, looking at the man who had been his shadow for 7 years. He saw the genuine terror in the assistant's eyes, the fear of a world where schedules weren't followed and billionaires acted on impulse. "Tell them I've finally found a merger that requires my full attention," Min-jae said, his voice quiet but absolute. "And tell them to stop calling. My phone is about to run out of power, and I have no intention of charging it." They stepped out onto the sidewalk, leaving the shouting voices and the polished marble behind. The neighborhood Frances lived in was a 20-minute drive away, a place where the skyscrapers of the financial district were merely a jagged, glowing silhouette on the horizon. It was a part of the city where life didn't wait for a board meeting to begin. As they arrived at the small, neighborhood park, Min-jae felt the analytical blindness that had defined his adult life finally begin to clear. He wasn't looking for market share or potential growth. He was looking at the way the streetlights caught the curls in Frances's hair and the way Jordan's small hand never let go of Barnaby the bear. The park was ordinary, a humble patch of green carved out between weathered apartment buildings. But to Min-jae, it felt more significant than any private island he had ever scouted for investment. There were no velvet ropes here, no VIP lists. Just the sound of a distant bus and the soft, rhythmic creak of a swing set. "The shop is just there," Jordan whispered, pointing a small finger toward a tiny, brightly lit storefront with a faded awning. Min-jae stood at the counter of the ice cream shop, reaching into his pocket for his wallet. He realized with a start that he didn't even know how much a chocolate cone cost. He had spent his life dealing in millions, yet he was momentarily paralyzed by the simplicity of a $5 transaction. He watched the elderly man behind the counter scoop the dark, rich cream, and when Min-jae handed over the crumpled bills, he didn't ask for a receipt. He didn't calculate the ROI. He simply took the cones and walked back to the bench where Frances and Jordan were waiting. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the soft tapping of Jordan's shoes against the wooden slats of the bench. Min-jae watched his son navigate the ice cream with a focused, methodical intensity, The boy's brow furrowed in that familiar, analytical way. Jordan wasn't just eating. He was ensuring the structural integrity of the cone, managing the drips with a precision that made Min-jae's heart ache with recognition. I spent so long trying to build a legacy, Min-jae said, looking at the dark ink on his hands, then up at the stars that were struggling to shine through the city's haze. I thought it was something I could leave behind, like a monument or a skyscraper. I thought if I made the Choi group big enough, I would be immortal. Frances leaned back, her peach blazer draped over her shoulders, her eyes watching Jordan with a fierce, quiet pride. Monuments are easy, Min-jae. They don't change. They don't have nightmares. They don't ask you why you're loud. She looked at him then, her gaze no longer a barricade, but a bridge. A legacy isn't what you leave for someone. It's what you leave in them. Min-jae looked at Jordan, who had successfully finished his ice cream and was now carefully wiping his sticky fingers on a napkin, arranging the used paper into a neat, folded square. The boy looked up and caught Min-jae's eye, a small, tentative smile breaking through his serious expression. It was a quick, bright thing, a second chance wrapped in a 6-year-old's face. In that moment, the billionaire CEO realized he had finally seen through his own blindness. His true legacy wasn't the signature on the skyscrapers or the zeros in the bank accounts. It was this small, brilliant boy who carried his mind and Frances's heart. It was the chance to be a person instead of a persona. Min-jae reached into his pocket and pulled out his encrypted phone. It was buzzing with a dozen urgent notifications, mergers, scandals, and demands for his time. He didn't read them. He didn't even check who they were from. With a steady hand, he held the power button until the screen went black, reflecting only the quiet green of the park and the faces of the family he had almost lost. I think Barnaby is ready to go home, Jordan said, clutching his bear as he stood up. Min-jae stood with him, feeling lighter than he had since he was 22 and sketching dreams on napkins. He didn't know what the morning would bring for the Choi group, and for the first time in his life, he didn't care. He reached out, and this time, when he offered his hand, Jordan took it. Me too, Min-jae said, walking away from the lights of his empire and into the quiet, beautiful reality of his life.